2 former presidents, 2 former prime ministers, 1 former deputy prime minister. Although they come from different countries, they have this much in common. Each has devoted his life to the workings and ideals of a particular form of government, one that in recent years a number of powers, including Russia and China, have rejected. Today on Uncommon Knowledge, the prospects for democracy. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Early this summer, a number of political figures, journalists, and academics gathered in Denmark to address certain threats, not threats to any particular nations, but to a form of government. They called their gathering the Copenhagen Democracy Summit, and our crew and I joined them. Filmed in Denmark, a special edition of Uncommon Knowledge. Our panel this morning, Building an Alliance of Democracies. As you just heard, I'm Peter Robinson of the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Our guests, Hendrik Ilves, elected as a member of the Social Democratic Party. Mr. Ilves served from 2001 to 2016 as the president of Estonia. Clegg, as a leader of the Liberal Democratic Party. Sir Nicholas served from 2010 to 2015 as the deputy prime minister of the United Kingdom. Harper, as leader of the Conservative Party. Mr. Harper served from 2006 to 2015 as the Prime Minister of Canada. Felipe Calderón, as a member of the Partido Acción Nacional. Señor Calderón served from 2006 to 2012 as President of Mexico. And José María Aznar, as leader of the Partido Popular. Señor Aznar served from 1996 to 2004 as the Prime Minister of Spain. Ilves, Harper, Felipe Calderón, Clegg, José María Aznar. Please welcome them. Gentlemen, 1989, the Cold War draws to a close, and the American political scientist Francis Fukuyama writes in what became a famous essay, quote, "We are witnessing the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government." 2018, today, Russia and China and other nations that seemed to be moving in the direction of democracy have now rejected democracy unambiguously. Anders Rasmussen this morning, quote, "Democracy is in decline in every region in the world." What went wrong? Sir Clegg?
I don't think it's possible to exaggerate the effect of 2008. In fact, I would go so far as to say that, certainly in my own country, if the financial crisis in 2008 had not happened, I don't think the United Kingdom would have voted to leave the European Union, and I don't think we would have the political paralysis we now have in one of the Western world's most long-established democracies. So what went wrong? A lot of things went wrong, but I think it is of the many body blows that democracy has suffered. I think the fact that millions upon millions of our fellow citizens in democracy after democracy after democracy feel that the system has screwed up for no fault of their own and that they are paying the consequences, they and their families are paying the consequences, I think that is, of the various problems we're facing, in my view, remains the most profound one of all.
Harper.
I would agree with that. I think I would start by saying that Francis Fukuyama was obviously wrong at the time. There really was precious little example or precious little evidence of China moving towards a democracy in the 1980s or 1990s, and only peripheral evidence that Russia was moving in that direction. So I think a lot of people got way ahead of themselves on that kind of a prediction. But I think essentially what Nick said is correct. Beyond that, ultimately, we love democracy because of the great ideals it encompasses, and I do think democracy has a great record over a long period of time. But ultimately, it is judged on its record. And for a lot of our citizens in the last 30 years in various countries, particularly those who had the global financial crisis, their outcomes have not been very good for a long period of time. And when you don't have good outcomes, that ultimately tends to reflect in people's judgment on the system.
Spain. Despite a difficult transition, Spain embraced democracy. Yet according to the World Values Survey, between 1995 and 2014, there was a 17% increase in the proportion of Spaniards who favored, quote, a strong leader over an elected government. Prime Minister Aznar, what do you say to Spaniards who are tired of democracy?
I like to be emotions one time, another time, every 10 years. But no, Spain is expressing a very great successful in the last 40 years. One is in terms of economic and social convergence, there is only 2 other countries in the world that are similar to Spain, that is South Korea and Japan. And second, Spain is a good expression of a very great success for the European Union. This convergence, the democracy in political terms, and existence of the European Union means the 2 great success for Spain, the total transformation of the country. This is true. But we live in on the other problems and other threats. No? But I hear my friends, but it is Greece and Russia, China and Russia, the attacks of September 11, and then the crisis in 2008, and then the consequences of the impressive revolution, technological revolution. This is my view.
President Calderón, a number of countries that share the Spanish inheritance, Cuba, Bolivia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, have now rejected democracy decisively for authoritarian rule. What do you say to these neighbors? What do you say to Miguel Díaz-Canel of Cuba or Nicolás Maduro of Venezuela to persuade them that they're making a terrible mistake?
Well, I have told a lot of things to them.
What have you said to them? What have you said
Actually,
to them?
I was declared persona non grata in Venezuela and in Cuba as well, which is an honor for
Felicidades.
me. But definitely, it's been a very difficult time for Latin America. The point is, authoritarian regimes, to have an authoritarian regime is always a temptation for any man or woman of power. And in Latin America prevails exactly the environment in which an authoritarian regime could prevail, unfortunately. These guys, dictatorships, are able to survive, even in such an open society in which we live, because, with all respect, the right persons don't care about that. And Latin America and these countries were abandoned in some moment of their lives. My impression with the first question is, we believe in the 80s and 90s that democracy was a final point or something. It's like a static
We were
equilibrium.
getting someplace.
And it's completely a mistake because it's not a static equilibrium. It's like a dynamic system. And democracy needs to be fed on daily basis about principles, outcomes for the people, and a lot of things. So we believe in Latin America, with the only exception of Cuba, Latin America was a democracy everywhere. But we fail in that analysis. It's like the fairy tales. No? The fairy tales ends when the prince married the princess and they were happy forever. And that is not true. Nobody talks about the problems of the couple after married and the temptation of the prince and so on. So democracy is not a fairy tale. So we abandon democracy. We say we got it and that's it. So we all were able to observe the changes in Venezuela, for instance, at the beginning of the century. Very few people did anything, probably me included. We believe that it's their own problem, and we are paying huge consequences in Venezuela, and Bolivia, and Cuba, and Nicaragua. I don't know, Mexico probably very soon. So it's a call to actions now because we need to reinforce and come back to the struggle in favor of democracy everywhere.
Tom Elvis, let's pause for a question of definition. Vladimir Putin was re-elected president of Russia with 70-some% of the vote just a matter of months ago. Nobody would call Russia a healthy democracy. So if it isn't the mere mechanical means of casting ballots that defines democracy, what else are we talking about? Give us the necessary attributes for a democracy?
Well, before I give you the real ones, I'd say that given that John McCain, Nick Clegg, and I have all been, like President Calderón, but in the case of Russia, have been declared persona non grata in Russia, maybe that's the definition. but certainly winning a popular vote, if you don't have free and fair elections, is not much of an accomplishment. If you don't have contested elections, if you don't have an independent judiciary, and in fact, in the case of a country like Russia, or actually virtually all non-democratic countries, an independent legislature, if you do not have if you don't have fundamental rights and freedoms, that you don't get put in jail for having the wrong opinion or posting the wrong opinion on Facebook or Kontakte, that the police, in fact, are in some way follow the rule of law. These are all characteristics of democracy that are fundamental. But if we simply look at, well, did you get a majority?
Not good enough.
It's, especially when there's no opposing candidate, or the result anyway gives you. That they're counting the votes, as Stalin said. It doesn't matter who wins, and what matters is who counts the votes.
All right. Again, the name of this panel is Building an Alliance of Democracies. Nick Clegg, what can an alliance of democracies accomplish that the United Nations could not? What is distinctive about what we're attempting to do at this conference?
Well, it's free of the bureaucracy and the institutionalization of the bodies like the UN. And also, I think, certainly events like this, liberate us all to be much more self-critical and candid than governments tend to be in those institutionalized settings. And I do think, without being hyperbolic about it, it's pretty clear to me, as it's now such a cliched observation to make, that unless democracies generally rediscover the ability to reform themselves and revitalize themselves socially and economically and politically, then of course democracy will be increasingly discredited in the eyes of millions and millions of people who we ask to vote every few years. And I think the great problem we have in one democracy after the next is stasis, it's paralysis. We're not learning the lessons of what happened in 2008. We're not dealing with the profound social injustices which were supposed to be solved by liberal democracy. And our political institutions, certainly in the democracies on either side of the Atlantic that I'm familiar with, just don't change. We have too much corruption in places, we have too much nepotism, we have too much, we have democratic systems which are not electorally answerable to the people. So I just, it's an old cliche, reform or die is a pretty good lesson, I think, for democracies to abide by, and that's the kind of thing you can discuss in a setting like this, which of course you never ever have in a meeting of the United Nations.
Right. So we can say things in the family, so to speak, that you couldn't say outside. Tom Ilves, you're well known for bringing Estonia into the digital age in a remarkable way while you were president. How does the digital environment shape your thinking about what democracy can and ought to do together?
Well, I'm actually quite concerned that the digital era has ushered in a period of extreme vulnerability for true democracies because we can be attacked. We've seen this over the past several years. Everything from hacking into candidates' servers, doxing or publishing what's in there, which is not simply a matter of Hillary Clinton, but we saw last year with Emmanuel Macron, with the targeted advertising, highly granular targeted advertising. So I'd say that since basically 2006, with the rise of Facebook or social media and the ubiquity of the mobile phone, we now have such a different media landscape that people can get into bubbles, they can be cut off from each other, but find thousands of people who have the same strange ideas, and all of these together mean that I think we're highly vulnerable.
And the attacks are asymmetrical. We can't mess up their democracies because, of course, they don't have democracies to mess up, to tamper
This is
with.
my point. You cannot, you cannot do to them what they do to you. I mean, what are you going to do? Prevent? I mean, you're going to change the result in the Russian elections? I mean, seriously. But what is, I think, even more crucial for us to understand is that there are a limited number of actors. I mean, to rattle them off, APT 28, 29, that's Fancy Bear, Cozy Bear, who are hacking groups. Then you have the troll farm in Petersburg. But the interesting thing is, and the very dangerous thing is, they're active in virtually all transatlantic democracies, and apparently now also in Mexico. So, I mean, it's not just the United States that got hit. It was, I mean, Macron, I mentioned, the German parliament, the Italian foreign ministry. I mean, you can go on and on and on about how democratic institutions have been attacked by a limited number of actors, and our problem is that in each case, the response has been national. The US deals with, these hackers. Britain deals with the hackers. In Spain, you had much of the Madrid, Catalonia sort of propaganda was actually done by Russia with Venezuela. Each country does it itself. Where we need, I think, bring democracies closer together is that a response to these kinds of asymmetric attacks require coordinated actions on the part of countries that are democracies, because those are the countries that are vulnerable.
Right. The question of Europe and the correct unit or basis for democracy. As Prime Minister in Spain and as Deputy Minister in Britain, you, José María Aznar, and you, Nick Clegg, both championed the European project. And Nick Clegg, you wrote a book entitled How to Stop Brexit. Not quite enough sales, apparently, but you wrote the book. Listen to the journalist John O'Sullivan, who served as a speechwriter and advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Quote, "The European Union presents itself as a fulfillment of democracy, a deeper and truer democracy than the discredited partisan bickering of political parties, yet it subverts democratic accountability, and it seeks to transfer ever-increasing powers from democratic institutions to bodies that reflect elite opinions and priorities." Close quote. We don't have time to argue the European Union or Brexit, but what I'm concerned with here is, how do we think through when there seems to be a debate, reopening perhaps, across Europe itself, about the correct unit or basis for democracy? How do we think that through? Nick?
Well, very quickly, I mean, there's no one size fits all. If you're the United States or Australia, this vast landmass on the other side of the planet, of course your worldview is different. Europe is a cluttered, crowded patchwork, quilt of different countries with different languages and traditions. It's a continent which has been submerged in its own blood on so many occasions over the last 100 years. We're right adjacent to some of the poorest countries in the world. In Africa, some of the greatest eruptions of violence in the Middle East and elsewhere. It is quite normal and right that that continent, where we are located with our history, tries to do stuff together, because we've worked out the hard way as a continent that if you do stuff together, you generally get more done than kind of pulling off in different directions. It's not perfect. The way that Brussels works is not perfect. Heaven knows, I spent 5 years in the European Commission and the European Parliament. Like all institutionalized forms of governance, it has its flaws. But it is a remarkable, and in my view, remains a remarkable effort at trying to act supranationally in a continent which, in my judgment, has to do so if it wants to give its citizens security, prosperity, and sustainability.
Prime Minister Aznar.
I don't believe in the United States of Europe. Don't believe in this. I think that Europe is the expression of the traditional nation states in Europe. It's the expression of history of the UK, of Germany, of Spain, of France, of Italy, or other countries. I don't believe in this idea. And I think it is impossible to eliminate the traditional nation state in Europe in trying to organize a multinational institution, a new institution, a federal institution that eliminate totally the nation states. No? Second, I think we live under various threats in Europe today, not only the question related with the Brexit, traditional threats relating with other countries. No? The technological revolution produced the 3 Ds, no? Disruption, disinformation, and decentralization. Never in the world. When I left office in 2004, there is none exist Apple, none exist Netflix, none exist Alibaba, none exist Amazon, none exist, almost none exist Internet. Well, it's totally different today. And the consequences in politics, in institutional system for democracies, so far of the technological revolution have been devastating. And third question, the most important immediate threat for Europe, more than the consequences of the Brexit, is the evolution of the consequences of migration policies. You're looking. In Africa, living today 1 billion people. In 2015, will live 2.4 billion people. It is impossible that European leaders don't reflect seriously about the consequences of the future of this for Europe and the coexistence of Europe of the same existence of Europe. We live in an existential question and moment in Europe today.
And Spain is separated from North Africa by 14 kilometers at the narrowest
No,
point.
exactly 12.
12?
12. But we have the
You were the prime minister.
12. But we have the advantage that we receive a lot of people
Right.
from Latin America.
Right. From Europe to North America. Mexico and Canada are both signatories of the North American Free Trade Agreement, an agreement that at the insistence of the United States is now being renegotiated. Then candidate Donald Trump speaking in 2016, we, the United States, have become more dependent on foreign countries than ever before. It's time to declare our economic independence once again, close quote. Democracies are committed to freedom, and the expansion of trade represents one of the great accomplishments of the last 7 decades since the Second World War. How can democracies promote freedom, including free movement of capital and indeed of labor, while still respecting national identity, including the integrity of borders? Prime Minister Harper.
Well, look, I guess I don't really think that's a huge challenge.
That's an easy one.
I was going to say in Canada, we've had deep, not just the free trade agreement that frankly predates NAFTA, we've had deep economic integration with the United States for decades, and we feel we've maintained our national identity and our sovereign status. So I don't think these things are incompatible. Peter, if I could maybe just make a general comment about the tenor of the discussion that maybe I differ a little bit with. I think we need to distinguish the difference between a genuine move away from democracy to anti-democratic systems, as we've seen certainly in Russia, and of course China has never even made the pretense of being a democracy, versus democratic outcomes that may be unconventional. The fact that there may be Eurosceptics or populists or nationalists or separatists elected is not, in my judgment, some kind of threat to democracy. In fact, it's an expression of a democratic system. And I think the worst thing that we who represent essentially the establishment of the center-right and center-left could do is start dismissing that as kind of equivalent to Russia and China. This is the population telling us they are unhappy. And what we've got to figure out is why that's the case and offer them better solutions for the things that are making them unhappy. But if we just tried to delegitimize all unconventional choices as anti-democratic, then I think we are going down equally dangerous ground.
Populism is not anathema. Populism is an expression of democracy itself.
But it becomes a problem when you begin to dismantle the fundamental institutions of democracy. So I agree completely.
With that.
But
No, I
when
agree with
you're
that.
going after the free press, you're going after the independent judiciary, then you're getting into sort of shaky ground.
Yeah. President Calderón.
Going back to your questions about the problem is, I agree with you, the free trade is a great achievement of this civilization. And the problem is when such a big leader just don't understand the benefits of trade. I don't know, it's a question of family education, so I don't know what is happening with this guy. But it's completely true that trade provides benefits for all, for producers, consumers, It makes more productive any economic system, more competitive. North America, by the way, including Canada, Mexico, and the United States, has been more competitive doing NAFTA than ever, I believe. And the way it is, how we can fix, how can we arrange such a complementary agreement? For instance, for the United States, export towards Mexico implies direct job for 1.1 million people. 1.1 million families depend directly exporting to Mexico. And if you consider the trade with Mexico, 6 million people are depending on that. So this guy, the President of the United States, could cancel the benefits for million families in the United States, workers. Or take just one example. Farmers in the central part of the United States. The best customer for those farmers are we, the Mexicans. We are buying for almost 20 tons a year of corn and wheat and so on. We can buy that to Brazilian guys or friends from Argentina, wherever, if he cancels the trade. And the people who will suffer the most are those people hard supporting of Donald Trump. But he doesn't understand the point. Or maybe he understands, I don't know, what's your opinion? He tried to ignore this brutal reality only to gain votes, only to catch this reaction. I agree with you, Nick. The problem is, after the economic crisis in the United States, we can find a lot of angry people about the outcome of the crisis and blaming someone else, and in particular choosing some foreign causes. So we, the Mexicans, are in this case the scapegoat of that problem, where we didn't create the economic crisis in the United States. We didn't create the mess of the economic consequences of 2008, 2009. Actually, we suffered that, but we are paying the political cost of that, and that is completely unfair. But we will survive.
Right, you've nicely teed
we defeated Germany. We can survive Donald Trump. You know.
Which leads
Mexico
beautifully to
defeated Germany.
Yes, indeed.
Oh, okay.
the role.
Well, I had a dream that Mexico defeated Germany.
I
should have.
The role of the United States. Two quotations. Here's quotation number one. Our host today, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, quote, "The world needs a policeman. The world needs a policeman. The only capable, reliable, and desirable candidate for that position is the United States. America is destined to lead." Close quote. Again, our host, Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Quotation two. The late American political scientist Irving Kristol, writing as long ago as 1983, he spotted it then, quote, "If we've learned anything from the experience of the last 30 years, that is the post-war years, it is that dependency corrupts. To the degree that Europe has been dependent upon the United States, European political vitality has diminished." Close quote. Once again, the name of this panel is Building an Alliance of Democracies. Must the United States remain dominant? Would you like to see less of the United States? This is subjective, I know, but how do we grapple with that problem? Prime Minister.
For me, it's very clear. I am a total Atlanticist convinced, and I defend this alliance between Europe and the United States with Canada and other countries. In 2008, I proposed a transformation of NATO in an alliance for freedom that we must to establish very close relations with Japan, with Australia, with Israel, with Colombia, with other countries. That is the expression of a new alliance of democracies. No? But the United States continues to be an indispensable power. And the only alternative to the United States today is or disorder in the world or China in the end of the fight. For me, it's not an alternative. I defend the idea of the Atlantic values based in the democracy and liberty and tolerance and pluralism and rule of law and free trade and so on is the best expression that we must defend for the current world and for the world in the future.
Tom Ilves.
Well, as long as Europe can't seem to get its act together on providing security, it will, by the default country, will be the United States. But I agree with Prime Minister Aznar that really it's one is not enough, and we really do need to do this together and also look beyond the transatlantic region, because I think that democracies such as Japan, Australia, they're going to be, they are already under threat, just as we are in the past several years, in this era when distance no longer means anything in the digital era.
Nick, isn't part of the idea of Europe to serve as a counterweight to the United States? Is that the way you conceive of it, or no?
No, I don't. I'm a fervent believer that Europe getting its act together collectively is a good thing for us, but I don't regard it as a project which is done against America. Far from it. The United States, strategically, until Donald Trump arrived, has always, in the post-war period, believed that its own interests are best served by a cohesive Europe. It's one of the reasons Britain, until summer 2016, played this pivotal role. It was able to play this role as a bridge between the European continent and the United States, and I think it was essential that we do so. But look, it's slightly repeating what I said earlier. I mean, strength, much as for us individuals, it's also for nations, comes from within. And as long as we are as battered and enfeebled internally as I think we are in the developed democratic world at the moment, the way in which external power is projected is always going to be uncertain and erratic. And I really, I strongly believe that we need to look ourselves hard in the mirror until we deal with some of the really profound shortcomings in the way in which developed democracies are now functioning socially, economically, and politically. We're never really going to sort of find our feet in the world as China and the East rises in power and in authority.
From the National Defense Strategy, a document published earlier this year by the American Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, quote, "It is increasingly clear that China and Russia want to shape a world consistent with their authoritarian model." Less than a generation after the end of one Cold War, we find ourselves in a new existential struggle against Russia, the largest landmass on Earth, and China, the largest population on Earth. Does that strike you as an accurate assessment, or Americans being melodramatic? President Calderón.
What a question. Well, I think it's accurate in part. It's true in part. Definitely China and Russia are trying to build their own leadership, in particular, both of them by different reasons, probably. But the question is how to deal with these emerging powers, big emerging powers. There is an expression coined at Kennedy School of Graham Allison saying, we need to avoid the Thucydides trap. And he refers to the fact that Greek was threatened by the emerging power of Cartagena, and they decided to go on war against Cartagena. And the point is that the Greeks won, but that was the beginning of the end of Greek. So they analyzed the moment in history in which a superpower, let's say the United States, perceives a threat coming from an emerging new power. Mm-hmm. If they get in a trap, they will go against and could provoke a very damaging and destroying war. So we need to avoid the Thucydides trap in this case. So we need to find a way in which we can deal with this emerging superpower of China. China will be the largest consumer, the largest producer, the largest population, probably will be the largest economy by the year 2050. And the way to, maybe the largest army, and the way to deal with that is not about provoking a conflict or trying to avoid that part. So it requires a lot of intelligence and democracy to deal with this new event. But the fact is, China is trying to get a leadership in several fields. We need to analyze what kind of leadership is acceptable, what kind of leadership is smart or not. And my final comment of this is one example. The global strategy of China, in order to capture such leadership, is one belt, one road strategy. So the strategy of the President of the United States is to build a wall. That's the global strategy to preserve the leadership. Well, China tried the wall strategy like several centuries ago. You know? And they built a big wall, it's a fancy one, but it's completely useless in this time. The new strategy for them is to build huge infrastructure all the way from Beijing to Europe through Turkey, to rebuild the Silk Road, and to build huge infrastructure in the sea, including Africa and Asia. Is that a right strategy? I believe it's a right one, and we cannot reject to do that. We need to think in a smarter way to find what could be the new equilibrium in the world for next century.
Prime Minister
Because
Harper
in this moment, China has not the capacity to challenge the US.
has not
It's not,
yet.
I think, and Russia, neither. The question in the future will be between US and China. And Russia will be a secondary actor with an enormous capacity to create problems, especially in Europe. But China today, gaining in economic influence, gaining nationalism, gaining self-reinforcement, but have not still the capacity to make serious challenges to the US.
You're right.
Stephen Harper?
Just one, I'm afraid that if the strategy is to rebuild the Cold War age, will be a bad strategy. That's
No,
my point.
the question is the studies, the American studies, the Thucydides trap. That is the world Peloponnese between Athens and Sparta. Was inevitable or was it beatable? The war of Peloponnese was inevitable for the expansion of Athens and for the fear in Athens. It's not a guarantee that it does not exist between China and the US, but we must pay a lot of attention to avoid this possible confrontation.
Stephen Harper, President Calderón and Prime Minister Aznar both said several times in a row now, we must do this, we must do this, we must do this. If we were to reconvene here in Copenhagen 5 years from now, what structures would you hope to have emerged by then? Again, the name of this panel is Building an Alliance. We have NATO, we have the United Nations. How can democracies engage in joint, how can we act as we?
I put the United Nations and NATO in very separate categories. You know, the United Nations is, as my father used to say, it's the forum of everybody, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The United Nations is not committed to democracy because a large percentage of its members are not committed to democracy. So it's not going to be the body that's going to build an alliance of democracies. I think as Prime Minister Aznar said and proposed at one time, it is conceivable that NATO is a security organization, but given its membership, it could conceivably be that kind of a structure. Now that would mean tackling some tough issues like what Erdogan's Turkey is doing as a vital member. So there'd be some real challenges there. Look, I think 5 years from now, here's the question that I think confronts us all. We talk about, I've always been a big believer in American leadership, particularly from the Canadian standpoint. American leadership in the world in terms of promotion of our economic interests, trade, markets, democracy, freedom. For Canada, this is vital, almost existential, that the United States play this kind of role in the world, and I'd like to see that. On the other hand, my observation as Prime Minister of Canada is there's been lots of examples of American leadership without much in the way of non-American followership. And, Americans have been told now for at least a generation a couple of things that are, frankly, at their heart, incompatible. One is that America has unique leadership responsibilities, and the other is that this is a multilateral world where America can't really lead. So which is it? I think the truth is the latter is more true. It is increasingly a more multilateral world. And that if we want, and I talk about Canadians and Europeans and others, if we who share, broadly speaking, the market-oriented democratic values of Western nations, if we want to see American leadership, we have to do more. And we have to be better at partnership and followership if we want that American leadership. Otherwise, I think that the Trump approach is a signal of the future. If America can't really lead, America's going to worry about itself. And so it's up to the rest of us, I think, to demonstrate that we really can be good and useful partners.
All right. Last question. The late leader of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, speaking in 1993, quote, "I do not believe that democracy necessarily leads to development. I believe that what a country needs to develop is discipline more than democracy. All right. In the last 30 years, we have China enabling 500 million people to escape poverty, experiencing a growth rate, a multiple of the growth rates that our countries have experienced. And now China is building a vast interconnected system of ports and highways, the Silk Road Initiative that you mentioned earlier, while investing in mines in Africa and Latin America and technology in the United States. I come from Silicon Valley. There's Chinese money buying up initiatives. I'd like to just go down the road to each of you. What does each of you say to a young person in your own country, somebody in his 20s, who's looking to the next half century and wants to know that he or she is not on the losing side? Nick Clegg, relatively slow growth in Britain, a current impasse over Brexit. Persuade a young Englishman or Englishwoman that democracy is still worth it.
Well, with difficulty at the moment, particularly the young person in Britain, because, as you know, the country is paralysed politically by this Brexit question, and yet over 70% of youngsters voted for a different future to the one which is now being imposed upon them. So what's happening in Britain now is an unprecedented experiment. There is no other democracy anywhere in the modern era that invites its population to vote on a future, decides by a wafer-thin majority to go in a completely different direction to where it's been for 40 years, against the explicit and stated wishes of those who have to inhabit that future, the young. And so I think we didn't touch on it here, one of the things that's emerging amongst many other fault lines in democracy is this terrible cleavage now between the generations. You see this over and over again in developed democracies, that whether it's pensions, whether it's housing, whether it's welfare, the older generations are hoarding common assets at the cost of the younger generation. I think that's imposing real strains on the legitimacy of democracy amongst younger voters. What we have to show them is that democracy, which is what is so different to democracy, amongst other things, from authoritarian, rigid, and disciplinarian regimes, is the ability to adapt, to listen to its people, to adapt and innovate. That's always been a great gift of democracy, is that we're more supple than Lee Kuan Yew's worldview. But the problem is, at the moment, we're not showing that suppleness or that adaptability. Instead, we're showing paralysis. So yeah, the stakes are high. I think it's tough to make that case, but boy, do we have to continue to do so.
President Calderón, unsettled political time in Mexico. I know you don't want to comment on the election, but you have an election in July. There is some tension in Mexico. What do you say to a young Mexican to persuade him or her that democracy is the way to go?
Well, it's quite a difficult question again, but
This is a harder question than I was expecting it to be.
What I would say to young people trying to explain briefly what is happening in China would say, well, if you choose a regime like in China, you will have not Twitter and you will not Facebook, and that's it. No, maybe it's a very powerful. It's a very powerful argument for them, I believe. We need to feed democratic values all the time. We need to talk about the value itself of freedom. Democracy is the only one regime in which freedom is the way to live. It's a guarantee. Freedom to choose, freedom to vote, freedom to speak. And those young generations, they are taking that for granted. They never imagine a world in which you have canceled your own liberties. So it's quite difficult, but we need to explain that. But the short answer is, I will explain that. In that regime, there is no Facebook, and there is no Twitter, and we have a very restricted mobile phone, and that's
finito.
Yeah. No, it's a difficult time for Mexico. Indeed.
Prime Minister Harper?
I guess I would say much the same thing. The strength of democracy over time is its resilience. We can make mistakes, but we can also correct mistakes. Governments can diverge from the interests of us as individuals or the collective interest, but we have mechanisms to pull it back. In an authoritarian state where things go off the rails, they really go off the rails. We can talk about the last quarter century of China as something that appears to have been on the rails, but you can talk about the quarter century of Chairman Mao as how badly off the rails a country can go, which frankly is unthinkable in a democratic system, anything that bad. I think the Chinese situation to me is really interesting because I think that under Deng, they developed an interesting model, admittedly for an emerging economy, one where there was collective leadership, some limits on individual power, kind of a dictatorship without a dictator. Now they've gone back, in a sense, to the old system, which is one-man rule for life. I will just observe, it's not an iron rule of history, but one man ruling for life almost always ends in stagnation, tyranny, or both. And it'd be very interesting to see where China is 30 years from now.
Yeah. Prime Minister Aznar.
Well, I try to practice with my great children every day. Explain them what is democracy. And explain them what is possible to establish that democracy is not the opposite, to have discipline. But trying to understand history. Once someone asked Winston Churchill, how do you want the world? He said, talking, talking, and talking. And it is true, because he converted the word in a word tool, but explain, talking about the people, especially the lesson of the history, for the young people especially, is extremely important. In these things of changes, reinforce our classical values in the liberal democracies is the best example, the best explanation for the young generation, in my opinion.
Tom Ilves, last word for you. Estonia is a country of fewer than 2 million people, bordering on a resurgent authoritarian Russia after having been held by Russia for decades, and also now witnessing the rise of an authoritarian China. What do you say to some kid in Estonia who's saying, between Russia and China, what do you say to a kid to say, no, democracy is worth it?
Well, first thing I tell them is study math.
Study math.
Math.
All right, Tom, explain that one.
Well, it's just that if you want to keep up with the world, you're going to need to understand what is happening technologically, and certainly that's something that I just have encouraged them to do for 25 years. Well, I mean, it's very hard for me to say, because we're actually getting to a point where we now have a generation that does not remember what it was like. Whereas up till now, we've been doing rather well because everyone remembered what the bad old days were like. And now we have coming into sort of full bloom, people 28, 29, 30, who do not know what it means to live in a country where you do not have democratic rights and freedoms. And I think this is part of the problem in much of Europe, is that many countries have forgotten, and many people have forgotten that. And that same sort of selfish demographic bulge that Nick was talking about, known as the baby boomers, at least they had some kind of idea of, we know what the old communist regime was like. Even older people remember what authoritarianism in the heart of Europe meant. So I agree. I think you really need to know your history and face that history, realizing how bad it can get, because no one believed in 1913 how bad it can get, because that was also an era of free trade, blossoming democracy.
Are you optimistic? Are you optimistic for the prospect for democracy?
I am always optimistic.
Stephen?
Yes, notwithstanding all our problems, we should have, with the technological advancement, the greatest possibilities of human life ahead of us.
Felipe?
No. I mean,
you have a chance. You have a chance to end this on a high note.
No, I don't like to be optimistic in political things, because if you are optimistic, you could be very disappointed. If you don't want to be disappointed, don't be optimistic. Be realistic. And the realistic thing is, it is possible to build the force for the good, or the force, no? We can build that. I'm not optimistic, but because it depends on us, but it's not easy. Most of the people that just live into these things because they are too much optimistic, they lose the chance. I don't want to lose it.
Nick, despite your intense frustration about the scene at home, do you remain fundamentally optimistic?
I'm very optimistic about what we've just talked about, the next generation, but I worry terribly that what we're handing to them is some very, very degraded and battered and bruised democratic institutions. I think we've handed a big, big job to our kids and our grandkids to fix a lot of problems that we've created for them.
I am a believer in the force of freedom. And I believe that the force of freedom is and continue to be unstoppable.
Thomas Ilves, Stephen Harper, Felipe Calderón, Nick Clegg, José María Aznar. I am Peter Robinson. Please join me in thanking our panelists.